Hey guys, welcome back to the French Revolution Part 4. Today we are going to talk a little bit about a new constitution. Yes, another constitution. We're going to talk about how the king tries to flee from France for his safety, but is betrayed. And then we're going to talk about some of the opposition that's developing abroad, some of the other European countries that have strong monarchies. And then finally, if we have time, in this one, we'll talk a little bit about what historians call the radical phase of the revolution. So come along. I hope you enjoy it. Hope you learned something. Okay, so here we are in 1791. A new constitution is complete. And what is established is a limited constitutional monarchy. It is interesting to note that the king is now called King of the French, and the emphasis is on the people. It's the element of the famous three values of the French Revolution: liberty, equality, and fraternity, with an emphasis on fraternity or nationhood. So he is no longer the King of France, now he's the King of the French, but he didn't have very much power. He had very little authority. And now also a new assembly is created in addition to the National Assembly. So if you remember, the National Assembly was formed during the Tennis Court Oath, but now they've created a new assembly in addition that really had the power. Representatives were chosen by indirect election. They were still pretty much controlled by the wealthy, many of whom were lawyers and radicals. And what really occurs during this time is that more and more radical groups start springing up. That is, these groups are offering more radical solutions to the problems that France is facing. So, for example, the terrible food shortages, the massive government debt, and they are proposing more and more radical solutions to these things. In addition, some political clubs start springing up, such as the Jacobins. The Jacobins were the most famous of these clubs, but there were over 900 various clubs, political clubs, in France at the time. New definitions are also created. For example, the revolutionaries want to distinguish between what they call active citizens and passive citizens. Active citizens referred to men over 25 years old who paid a certain amount in taxes, and only active citizens could vote. Passive citizens, on the other hand, were women and non-property holding men. Jews and Protestants, interestingly enough, at this time, got full citizenship. And this was something pretty radical for this time period. And in order to have better organization and better control, the National Assembly divides France up into departments, districts, and communes, which are all supervised by elected councils. And these councils were dominated by the bourgeoisie. This year, also, revolutionary restructuring occurs, but the consensus is challenged by a lot of clerics, that is, priests, or people that are clergy. And that's because the financial impact of issuing these assignats, the things we talked about in the last video, the paper money that they just started printing up after they took all the land owned by the church and sold it off, it caused terrible inflation. And so just like always, the financial impact was felt much more amongst the lower classes. And so especially the peasants were still paying very unfair taxes, and this was creating a lot of problems. So what you see is the revolutionaries here are trying to solve some of the major problems that France is facing, and they also are having a lot of trouble doing so. And here in 1791, the king also is in a bit of a panic, and he tries to flee. He is trying to flee to the Netherlands, where they have some royal family that they can hide with. So the king and his wife plan to hide in the Netherlands, but he is betrayed by a postman, and he's captured at a place called Varennes. They arrest him and they return him to Paris. Some people ignored this, but other people wanted the king deposed. They wanted him to no longer be their monarch. And so there was debate over what to do with the king at this point. In the meantime, there's a lot of opposition developing abroad. Other major European nations, particularly Prussia and Hungary and Austria, are very concerned about what's going on in France. They don't want it to spread. They don't want people in their own countries to get any ideas. And so Leopold II of Austria and Frederick William II of Prussia formed something called the Declaration of Pillnitz, inviting other European monarchs to help the King of France, but then they end up backing out. And then on April 20th of 1792, France goes on the offensive. So France is very much wanting to fuel the revolution, to get it to spread across Europe. So it's not just a defensive thing, but the Legislative Assembly declares war on Austria. And France does not do very well in the war. They're not very prepared initially. And they now have not only these domestic problems, tensions, and the varying radicalized groups that are all competing for power, but they also now have this international situation with a number of nations that are trying to stop the revolution and to bring back the monarchy. And so they've got all of these problems coupled with the terrible financial crisis that they still haven't been able to solve. So what you have now in this what we call the radical phase of the revolution between 1792 and 1793 is competing visions of what the revolution should be. And this creates total chaos in France. You have the extreme left, known as the sans-culottes, which literally just means without knee breeches. Regular people, common people is what that represented, and the Jacobins. And then on the extreme right, you had the émigrés, who wanted to restore things to the old order. Paris mobs and radical political groups are carrying on demonstrations. One of these attacked the royal palace, and in August, the Legislative Assembly captures the king, forces the Legislative Assembly to suspend the monarchy, and then calls for what they call a national convention. And they want this new entity to be chosen on the basis of universal male suffrage. Remember, their definition to this point of an active citizen was a male who had a certain amount of property over the age 25. But now the demands are becoming more radicalized, and people are calling for universal male suffrage. There's another group called the Paris Commune, which was made up mostly of a group called the Sans-Culottes, which, by the way, it just meant without knee breeches, as I think I just mentioned. But what they were really trying to say was that we are just ordinary people. We're ordinary patriots without fancy clothes. But they weren't really the poor. They were mainly well off, but they were trying to make a statement, I think, largely against what the old aristocratic titles and privileges. And so all of these things happening begins what historians call the radical phase of the French Revolution. And so at this point, the revolutionaries give up on the idea of a limited monarchy, and they give up on the Constitution of 1791, and they depose the king, dissolve the assembly, and create a new government body called the National Convention. And at this point, they declare that France is no longer a monarchy, not even a limited monarchy, but now it's a republic. The tricky part however, is that this newly appointed National Convention does not have control over all of France. There were a lot of factions ruling territorially. There were different factions in Paris than in other parts of the country. And so people were really divided over what to do next. And it's really hard to get your mind around all the many groups that existed during this time period, but I will just define a few of them for you, the ones that are probably the most well known. So the first group would be the Jacobins. And as I mentioned, they had been just a political club, but they become very popular and they grow. And they take a lot of power. They have a lot of power. And they want to remove the king and set up a republic, but there's a split within the Jacobins over what to do about the king in terms of, do we keep him alive? Do we kill him? He's a traitor to the French people. The Girondins wanted to keep him alive and give him a fair trial. They also don't like the more radical measures that we'll talk about in the next video, like de-Christianization. But in early 1793, they sort of are too moderate and they get purged. And then another group within this dialogue is a group called the Mountain, and they want to kill him, and they are the ones who get their way. So there's another aspect, and that's the localized aspect. And I think I mentioned this before. The Paris Commune, so this particular group that was very strong in Paris, was one of those groups that favored radical change. And they had a very extreme leader named Marat. So this radical leader, Marat, was a very interesting guy, but we don't really have time to get into him. But if you have time and you want to do some Googling, he was a very colorful guy. He called for so many people to be beheaded. He wrote, he had like a newspaper called The People, translated from French, and he was always labeling people enemies of the revolution. He ends up being murdered in his own bathtub, and that is the famous painting by Jacques-Louis David. And it's known as The Death of Marat. And then there's a more sensible leader, Danton, who believes that a lot of the individual rights of the revolution are being sacrificed for these extreme ideals. And he ends up losing his head in the argument. And then there's another thing going on. You've got the Vendée Rebellion, where peasants are revolting against being drafted by the Republican Army, and they end up being a counter-revolutionary force, wanting to restore the old regime. And I mentioned in the last video that the peasants tended to be more conservative, certainly than the middle class. And you may find that surprising, but a lot of the peasants were actually counter-revolutionaries. And so that really brings us to the end of this section. We will be talking a little bit more about some of the foreign problems that were going on, and then the reign of terror with Robespierre in the next section. But hopefully you learned a little something in this one. And I will see you next time.